The silence in the grand halls of Abidjan is not the peace of a resting giant, but the heavy, suffocating air of a strategic calculation gone catastrophically wrong. For half a century, Côte d'Ivoire has worn a crown forged in the fires of a specific, narrow vision, a vision where the prosperity of the coast was built upon the isolation of the interior. This was the crown of the proxy gateway, the gilded door through which the wealth of the Sahel flowed out, and the directives of a distant colonial echo flowed in. If dignity matters more than the noise of old empires, give this a like. We go line by line through the documented shift of power. Today, that crown is not being stolen by force. It is being made irrelevant by the calloused hands of those who have decided that their soil is no longer for sale. The shift began as a whisper in the dusty corridors of Ouagadougou and Bamako, but it has grown into a roar that is shaking the glass towers of the Ivorian plateau. The architects of the proxy state, those who believed that geography was a cage they could lock from the outside, are now staring at a horizon they no longer control. The bare truth is as stark as the midday sun over the Sahel. Abidjan, once the self-proclaimed Paris of West Africa, was never just a city. It was a mechanism. It was the primary valve through which the resources of the landlocked nations were filtered, taxed, and moved. When the leadership in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger decided to forge the alliance of Sahel states, they didn't just sign a security pact, they signed an economic declaration of independence. They began to divert the lifeblood of trade away from those who sought to weaponize their access to the sea. Consider the magnitude of this pivot. Historically, more than 60% of the transit for nations like Burkina Faso relied upon the Ivorian corridors. This was a relationship built on necessity, but it was sustained by a false sense of security in Abidjan. The gatekeepers believed that the Sahel had no choice but to bend the knee to the coastal powers. They believed that by aligning themselves with the old world order, they had secured their position as the eternal intermediaries of West Africa. But as the open gates of Togo began to swing wide, and as the strategic partnership with Lomé offered a hand of genuine brotherhood rather than a shackle of conditions, the pivot became a reality. The road is no longer a one-way street leading to Abidjan. It is now a bridge to a multipolar future. The seeds of sovereignty have been sown in the dry earth of the interior, and the harvest is one that the coastal elites never expected to see. This leads us to the pivotal question that keeps the advisors in the presidential palace awake at night. How did a nation that once prided itself on being the leader of the region find itself so strategically isolated? The answer lies in the heat of 2023, in a moment of arrogance that would set the stage for the current economic collapse. It was a time when the drums of war were being beaten by those who claimed to be brothers, yet were ready to lead the charge for a foreign interest. The battalions were pledged, the borders were slammed shut, and the trap was set. But as the dust settled, the architects realized they had not trapped the Sahel. They had trapped themselves. The very hands they tried to chain are now the hands building a new world, leaving the old order to wonder where it all went wrong. To understand the current tremors in Abidjan, we must revisit the feverish heat of August 2023. It was a moment of profound theatricality on the international stage, where the lines between African solidarity and external directives became dangerously blurred. President Alassane Ouattara did not merely sign a decree or issue a diplomatic statement. He positioned himself as the lead singer in a chorus of hawks, demanding the immediate and forceful restoration of a fallen order in Niger. The pledge was public, specific, and aggressive. A full battalion of Ivorian soldiers was promised to spearhead an ECOWAS intervention force. At that moment, the architects of the proxy state believed their power was absolute. They felt the invisible hand of their patrons on their shoulders, whispering that the Sahel would shatter under the weight of a coordinated strike. They weaponized their geography, their ports, and their rhetoric, convinced that the Paris of West Africa held all the cards in this high-stakes game of geopolitical poker. But the gamble of the hawk was built upon a fundamental miscalculation of both time and loyalty. While the leadership in Abidjan was busy preparing for a conflict that would have pitted brother against brother, the ground was already shifting beneath their feet. The uniform was beginning to outthink the suit. If this helped you think more clearly, a simple thank you in the comments is more than enough. And we continue. The first crack in this strategic mirage appeared when the very patrons who encouraged the aggression began to quietly pack their bags. For decades, the presence of the colonial echo in Côte d'Ivoire was seen as an eternal guarantee of security for those who served its interests. Yet as the winds of change swept through Mali and Burkina Faso, the priorities of the old world order shifted. The once sturdy pillars of support began to show signs of erosion. Reports began to circulate of a strategic withdrawal, a resizing of the footprint that had defined Ivorian sovereignty for generations. The planned reduction of the military presence in Abidjan, forecasted to drop from 900 personnel to as few as 600, sent a clear, unspoken message to the presidential palace. The architects of the proxy state were being left to navigate the storm they had helped to create, largely on their own. This is the isolation that currently haunts the corridors of power. The battalion that was meant to march into Niamey never left its barracks, not because of a change of heart, but because the strategic reality had become too toxic to touch. The alliance of Sahel states did not wait for the strike. They moved first, and they moved in a way that the coastal elites could not counter with tanks or infantry. They moved with the silent, devastating power of economic redirection. The leaders in Abidjan had forgotten the most basic law of the land. Those who control the soil and the resources of the interior ultimately hold the keys to the coast. By treating the Sahel as a subordinate hinterland rather than a sovereign partner, they invited a boomerang effect that is now returning with terrifying precision. The very sanctions they championed to starve their neighbors have instead begun to starve their own treasury. The suit, once seen as a symbol of sophisticated diplomacy, now looks increasingly like a costume of the past, out of touch with a generation of Africans who value the calloused hands of the worker over the polished speeches of the intermediary. The uniform, in the eyes of many, has become the symbol of a new, uncompromising dignity, a refusal to be used as a blunt instrument for foreign agendas. As the French military presence shrinks and the Big Brother protection fades, a chilling realization is setting in. You cannot maintain a crown when the people you claim to rule from afar have already built their own kingdom. The architects are finding themselves in a house of cards, and the wind is starting to blow from the north. But the true blow did not come from a military strike or a political speech. It came from a shift in the very thing that made Abidjan wealthy: the flow of goods and the lifeblood of trade. The hubris of the gatekeeper is often its undoing. For years, the docks of Abidjan were viewed not just as infrastructure, but as a leash, a tether that could be pulled whenever the interior nations sought to assert their own will. The architects of the proxy gateway believed that because the Sahel was landlocked, it was also mine-locked, forever dependent on the mercy of the coast. They did not anticipate a day when the road would simply stop leading to their door. Today, the Ivory Coast port crisis is no longer a whispered concern in the boardrooms of the Maritime Authority. It is a visible, haunting reality. The silence at the terminals is deafening. Where there once stood miles of idling trucks, there is now an emptiness that speaks of a profound geopolitical divorce. The lifeblood of transit, which once accounted for a massive portion of the national revenue, has begun to evaporate, leaving behind the dry salt of a failed strategy. This is the economic boomerang in its most lethal form. When the sanctions were first imposed, they were designed as a weapon of starvation, a tool to force the people of the Sahel to choose between their dignity and their daily bread. But the leadership in Mali and Burkina Faso responded with a strategic brilliance that has redefined the map of West Africa. They did not beg for the gates to be reopened, they simply found new ones. The pivot to the port of Lomé in Togo was not merely a tactical move, it was a declaration of partnership. While Abidjan chose the path of the enforcer, Togo chose the path of the brother. This shift has triggered a massive realignment of supply chains that had remained unchanged since the colonial era. Every container that is now offloaded in Lomé and moved through the new corridors to Ouagadougou or Bamako is a direct loss to the Ivorian treasury. We are talking about hundreds of millions of dollars in fees, taxes, and secondary economic activity that has vanished from the coastal terminals. If you want the lights kept on for careful analysis, consider joining as a member. We'll stay precise and follow the evidence where it leads. The panic in Abidjan is not just about the loss of state revenue, it is about the collapse of a domestic business model. Thousands of Ivorian merchants, logistics firms, and transport operators were built entirely on the foundation of the Sahel trade. They are now the collateral damage of their own government's desire to please a distant patron. These business owners now watch with a mixture of envy and despair as the open gates of Togo facilitate the very trade they were told would never leave their shores. The Sahel has proven that geography is not destiny. By investing in dry ports and streamlining border procedures with partners who respect their sovereignty, the alliance of Sahel states has effectively bypassed the blockade. The bridge of brotherhood is proving far more resilient than the walls of sanction. The dust of the road now settles on the trucks moving north from Togo, while the rust settles on the cranes of Abidjan. This is the price of using a service as a weapon. Once a service is weaponized, it will be replaced. The trust that was shattered in 2023 cannot be mended with a few diplomatic meetings or a reduction in port fees. The Sahel has tasted the freedom of a diversified supply chain, and they have no intention of returning to the leash. The architects in the presidential palace now face a terrifying paradox. To win the trade back, they must acknowledge the sovereignty of the very leaders they tried to unseat, but to do so would be to admit the failure of their proxy mission. They are caught between a dying influence and a rising reality, and the floor is dropping out beneath them. As the economic weight shifts, the political isolation of the coastal hawks deepens. They are beginning to realize that the colonial echo they so faithfully followed has led them into a cul-de-sac. The halls of international diplomacy are often filled with the echoes of promises that have no intention of becoming reality. For months, the summits of ECOWAS and the corridors of the African Union were vibrant with the rhetoric of defending democracy and enforcing legal mandates. But as the dust of the blockade settles, a cold, clinical truth is emerging. The international patrons who once stood behind the podiums in Abidjan, nodding in approval as the sanctions were announced, are nowhere to be found when the invoices for the economic fallout arrive. The strategic isolation of Côte d'Ivoire is not just a regional phenomenon, it is a global one. While the leadership in Abidjan faithfully executed the playbook of the old world order, the world order itself was busy recalibrating. From Paris to Washington, the focus has shifted. The colonial echo, once loud and authoritative, is now fading into a mumble of re-evaluating priorities and strategic drawdowns. The proxy, having served its purpose in attempting to destabilize the Sahel, is now being left to account for its own losses. Tell me where you're watching from, city and country, and from all of us at Burkina Rising, may the light of truth always guide your path, and we stay precise as we follow the evidence. Why has the support vanished? Because the paper tigers realized too late that the Sahel is no longer a vulnerable target. The sudden and sophisticated emergence of the multipolar shield has paralyzed the old mechanisms of intervention. When the alliance of Sahel states welcomed the defensive expertise of Russia, the technological surveillance of Turkey, and the massive infrastructural capital of China, they didn't just find new friends. They built a fortress of AES economic sovereignty that cannot be breached by the traditional tools of pressure. The diplomats in the West now look at the map and see a reality they cannot control. They see a landlocked region that has mastered the art of the pivot. They see a generation of leadership who speak the language of dignity, not dependency. And most importantly, they see that the cost of an actual military strike would be too high for a fading empire to pay. Consequently, the rhetoric of intervention has been quietly replaced by a desperate back-channel scramble for dialogue. This shift has left the leadership in Abidjan in a perilous position. They were the ones who burnt the bridges with their neighbors. They were the ones who sacrificed their own merchants and transporters for the sake of a collective message. Now, as the Sahel prospers through its new alliances and Togo reaps the rewards of its courage, the Ivorian elites are realizing they were sold a map to a world that no longer exists. It is a masterclass in the betrayal of the proxy. Throughout history, the gatekeepers of a dying empire have always been the first to be sacrificed when the tide turns. The financial aid promised by international financial institutions to offset the cost of democracy has remained entangled in red tape, while the reality of the AES economic sovereignty continues to build a new, tangible prosperity on the ground. The invisible chains of the old financial systems are being dismantled link by link. The Sahel has proven that when you refuse to be a pawn, the entire game board changes. The architects in the coast are now watching the dawn of a new era from the shadows of their empty ports, realizing that loyalty to a foreign master is a poor substitute for the solidarity of a brother. But as the old foundations crumble, the question remains: what is the true price of this betrayal? And can the wounds of the past year ever be healed? Or is the divorce between the coast and the interior now final? History is a silent witness, but its judgment is absolute. We are witnessing the final chapters of an era where the coast could dictate the breath of the interior. The harvest of the seeds planted in 2023 has arrived, and for those who chose the path of the proxy, the fruit is bitter. The Ivory Coast port crisis is not merely a logistical failure. It is the physical manifestation of a broken promise. The moment a nation realized that the shadow of a dying empire cannot provide the warmth of true African brotherhood. The road that once led exclusively to Abidjan is now overgrown with the weeds of regret. The cranes that once swung with the weight of Sahelian wealth now stand like rusted sentinels, watching a horizon that has moved elsewhere. This is the price of betrayal, to be left alone in a house of luxury while the neighbors you tried to starve are building a city of light. The prophetic shift in power is no longer a theory, it is a lived reality. The calloused hands of the Sahel have turned the lock on the old world order, proving that no wall of sanctions can withstand the fire of a people determined to be free. The dawn of the Sahel is not just about trade or military might, it is about the restoration of a dignity that was stolen 400 years ago. By asserting their AES economic sovereignty, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger have shown that the soil belongs to the sower, not the overseer. They have turned the dust of conflict into the mortar of a new foundation. If you believe that the dignity of a nation is not for sale, subscribe and pass this to one steady heart. We build with facts, not fury. That's the pulse of the Sahel. The Ivory Coast port crisis serves as a final haunting lesson for the continent, that when you cut off your brother's hands, you ultimately find yourself unable to hold your own future. The architects of the proxy state are now realizing that the colonial echo they followed has led them to a silent shore. But as the sun sets on the old world, it rises with a fierce and beautiful clarity over the Sahel. The chains are off, the gates are open, the era of the puppet is over. Join us in our next analysis as we look at the stumbling giant, Nigeria, and why the very leadership that sought to enforce the will of the West is now finding itself paralyzed by an internal storm it cannot control.